Hi, everyone. By the way, how fantastic is it that you've all just been in services for 3 hours and then lunch for an hour, and you're here for more learning? So this is like pretty wonderful. And I know that there are many people who are with us online now, and then also who will watch this afterwards. And so, Julia, we are just beyond ecstatic to get to do this with you. The news was like there was a buzz through our office and through our community when the announcement was made about the Pulitzer. And we immediately said, we have got to get Julia to come do a talk with us. It's not every day that a member of your community receives an honor such as this, and so we're so proud of you. And not just a member of our community, but really a great volunteer and leader in the community. And it's so exciting and wonderful for me and for us that the world sees in you what we also see in you. So it's not all about external validation, but sometimes it's nice when you get the external validation. So I just really wish you mazal tov. We're so excited. Yes. Here's to Julia. I'm going to give a brief, sort of more formal bio of Julia so that folks have a little bit more context. Julia is a Metro reporter for the LA Times, covering Los Angeles City Hall. She, of course, won the Pulitzer for the work that she and her team did. Oh, sorry, first, you were a finalist in 2022 in breaking news for your work covering a fatal shooting on the set of the film Rust. She was also the author of the Essential California newsletter, which many of us read. And before joining the Times in 2019, she was the editor-in-chief of the LAist and senior editor at Long Reads. She grew up here with her beautiful family, all of whom are beloved IKAR members. Julia, along with a few of her colleagues, won the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for their investigation of LA City Council members' secretly recorded meetings, where several of them used, as we remember, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racist language to talk about other council members and to talk about constituents as they discussed their plans to shape the city's redistricting to their own advantage. So they claimed, in order to increase Latino power and to reduce Black representation on the council. This was, of course, incredibly disturbing to us, and the political fallout has been real and significant. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Julia is a longtime and, as I said, beloved member of IKAR, and we want to celebrate you and lift you up for the incredible work that you are doing. And we want to just have you offer us kind of what you see from your vantage point, your front row seat to LA City governance. So thank you so much for being with us, Julia. We're absolutely thrilled to get to have this time with you.
So excited to be here.
Great. Okay, I want to start by asking you, for those who have not, for those who haven't followed the story closely, or maybe are new to Los Angeles, or for whatever reason can't remember back to when the story actually came out, can you give us a summary of what the City Council tapes revealed and what you think is really the impact of this story?
Yes, absolutely. So it was, we reported on this in October of last year, so I guess about 9 months ago. And it was just one recording. It was a secretly recorded, leaked audio recording of 3 members of the City Council, including the then City Council president, and a very powerful labor leader, Ron Herrera, who at the time was head of the LA County Federation of Labor, meeting about a year prior in October 2021. It was ostensibly a meeting about the once every decade redistricting process, but during this kind of conversation, they, particularly Nuria Martinez, who at the time was president of the City Council, spoke in really, really racist terms about some of her colleagues, about a colleague's young child. And they also had, redistricting is always kind of like bare knuckles politicking, but they spoke in unusually frank terms about carving up the city, and particularly carving up the city for their own political gain to kind of protect them and their allies.
So you were the reporter that got the tip, right?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what the investigation process looked like? What do you do when you receive a tip like that? How do you know if it's real? What do you do to authenticate it? What's the legal and ethical framework for moving forward once you receive something like that?
Absolutely. So this was, I guess, October 8th. And my colleagues and I on the City Hall desk had all been really in the middle of covering mayoral and city council elections. So it had been kind of like a frenzy for a few months there. And I got a tip on a Saturday afternoon that there was this tape that had these city leaders saying really kind of horrific things. And my first thought when I heard about it before I had listened to it was that it would be really hard to verify that it was real. And then once I started listening to it, it's about 80 minutes long, it was sort of instantaneously clear that it would have been almost impossible to fake because it was so long and it had these people who I'm so familiar with, most of them, I've listened to them talk at great length, talking about things I've heard them speak about many times before throughout this process and speaking in this really kind of minute detail. But so we immediately started, a couple of my colleagues, very quickly the rest of the City Hall desk jumped on, and our editors as well, just trying to go through and listen to the whole tape because there's so much kind of going on in it, and it's really, at parts, really difficult to hear what people are saying, and kind of dividing it up and just going through it and then contacting the people who we knew were in the recording. And so how we ended up publishing very early the next morning, and our ultimate confirmation was that the LA Fed sent a letter, like a kind of a legal threat letter about not publishing this because it was illegally recorded, and I believe it was, I don't have it in front of me, but that it was their property as well. So basically they inadvertently were the confirmation that it was.
Wow.
Federation of Labor. So one of the speakers was, yes, sorry.
So, and we still don't know who.
We don't know, and that's sort of the big mystery. And one thing everyone is still looking into. The LAPD has been investigating as well, and there really is no clear answer for who recorded it because it was incredibly damaging for all four people who were on the tape. So it's hard to imagine that any of them would have released it on their own.
Right.
It was uploaded to Reddit a couple of weeks before we reported on it, and it was kind of circulating on Reddit, and what Twitter account was, like a dozen followers had tweeted about it, but it was sort of not really publicly known at all. And so there's a lot of theories about who might have recorded it, but no real information.
I remember it came out during a 2-day Yontif. We were in the midst of, I was offline fully for 2 days. And so I came out of Yontif and we heard the story. And I remember my first reaction was, okay, there were tapes where people said things that were kind of unkind and disrespectful of their colleagues, and now people are calling for their resignation. That seems like an overreach. Why don't we get them to make tshuva and have them, apologize? And then I read what they said, and then heard what they said, and I thought, oh my God, this is the leadership of this city. And so I don't know if others had a similar experience, but because by the time I got the news, people had already come to the conclusion that they needed to resign. You've been in this for a long time, and you knew these folks well. Did it surprise you how egregious these comments were?
Absolutely. There's parts of it I wasn't surprised by, like the kind of politicking about redistricting and the protecting our people and not protecting the people who don't help us politically. None of that surprised me. I think the most surprised I was by, I think for a lot of people, the most upsetting kind of thing there, besides for just and it's mainly Nuri Martinez who's making these comments, and people kind of occasionally chime in, but I think she says sort of many of the worst things on there. Besides for the fact they managed there's a lot of anti-Black racism, but they also really kind of make at times like derogatory or crude remarks about sort of a rainbow coalition of groups in Los Angeles. Almost like they really it's kind of astounding how many different groups get occasionally, But I was most surprised by the way they spoke about. There's a former council member, Mike Bonin, who's a white man who has a young adopted Black son, and the way they spoke about his son was, and you had asked earlier about kind of what we were thinking that night. That to me was, as a reporter, I felt there was we had to write about this because these were the leaders of our city and there was an enormous public interest. But I think all of us were really, really aware that night that the way they were speaking about a child, like this was a kid who's going to go to school, and once this is in the newspaper, they're never going to, I'm not being articulate, but that was something that just as like a person weighed incredibly heavily on all of us.
You're one of the most articulate people I've ever read and heard from. So
better in writing.
We really appreciate you and your voice, Julianne. I know it's hard to talk about this stuff. I mean, I'm really curious to know more about the dynamic tension in really good news outlets between sharing a story that you think is in the public interest to hear about and the urgency of getting that story out, on one side, and then really needing to get all the ducks in a row and making sure that it's totally verified, that, it's rock solid evidence. And because I think that that's in a lot of the big cases that have really changed things in our society, in our time, there's this tension, and I can see the kind of drive and the desire. I'm thinking about Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey and the desire to kind of get that story out for the greater good, but needing to pull back and wait and research and confirm and affirm. And you said you took basically it took a day, and you were able to condense that period really well so that you could get it out very quickly. How do you see the tension between getting information into the hands of the public and also protecting the integrity of the institution and making sure that you're not jumping the gun and getting something out there too soon before you're fully certain about it?
It's a constant tension, and one I wish I had a better answer to. I think it's kind of something we're wrestling with every day, particularly because it's a bit different with like a longer investigation, like the ones you mentioned, where those might have been, months-long investigations, but particularly when you're dealing with breaking news or stuff where it's competitive to get it out, you really have until print deadline to kind of finish what you're working on, and then you have to put something in the paper, and there's no, making changes after that. So you almost are sort of just constantly, like, what you have is what you can print that day, and that's why a lot of stories end up being pretty iterative, where, you have what you were able to verify that day, and then the next day, you put in a little more. But I think, it's one thing we were thinking about a lot. So I think I heard about it around 3 or 4 p.m. on Saturday, and very quickly colleagues jumped on, and we were working, and we were first trying to get something up that night, and I think around 10 p.m., and this wouldn't have been for print, this just would have been online, but around 10 or so p.m., the decision was made. We were going to wait until the morning just because we felt like the material was so explosive that we wanted to handle it in the most responsible possible way, and we just hadn't had enough time to even feel like enough ears had listened to the entire tape through in those hours, and so we ended up waiting until the morning.
You waited. So, I mean, I'm assuming that you just said you knew how explosive it was, that this was going to rock the city council, it was going to rock the city. Did you ever imagine that it would have the actual outcomes that came as a result of the story being broken?
It's an interesting question. I think I didn't really have time to think it through, to be honest. There's been outcomes that I think have been really positive, too. I think it was one of those things where people were so incredibly upset by it and upset by what they heard that it kind of was a tipping point in terms of Angelenos paying attention to local government, which is not something historically that they've done a whole lot. And I think in recent years, there's been, a much broader outside of the IKAR community, obviously, where everyone knows who their city council person is and is paying attention. But outside of IKAR, it's not always the case. And I think there's been a broader push over the last couple of years that relates to a couple of things. I think, so in LA, elections got moved from odd years to even years beginning in 2020. And it's one of those things that seems a bit arcane, but it actually makes a massive difference in participation. the odd year electorate tended, LA is a city that's majority minority and also majority renter. The odd year electorate was much whiter, richer, more likely to be homeowners than the city at large. The even year electorate, which is a much broader electorate because it coincides with state and national elections, is much more diverse, it's younger, it tends to be a bit more progressive. And so this kind of small shift has like fundamentally altered the city, and will continue to alter the city, I think.
You hinted at this earlier, but I want to go back to what the content was, not of these extremely obscene racist comments that they made, which I just thought were breathtakingly awful, but actually for some of what they were talking about in terms of redistricting and controlling the redistricting process, which I know many people who heard the tape said on both fronts, both on the racism and the redistricting, they're saying the quiet part out loud. Like, this is what we've all suspected was going on all along, but we didn't have the overt recorded evidence to prove it. So can you talk a little bit about the efforts to control the redistricting process and what you think that the tapes revealed about where we've been and where we might be heading?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of different things going on. And the first thing is to kind of separate out the really racist stuff they're saying, which you of course can't totally separate out. But to kind of put that aside for a second, there's a really important racial kind of context to understand about redistricting in LA, which is that historically Latinos have been really underrepresented in positions of power in LA, and that redistricting has been a part of that. So at the time when this conversation was recorded, Latinos who make up roughly half the city and half the county accounted for a quarter of the seats on the city council, which is real disparity. And it's something that, is a real pain point in the city. That has shifted a tiny bit with the election of Hugo Soto Martinez in CD 13. So now Latinos counting Nuri Martinez's seat, which is currently empty, but both candidates for it are Latino, make up a third of the council, so that's a little closer to 50%, but not there. This is kind of part of broader demographic shifts in the city as well, whereas Black Angelenos account for a little less than 10% of the city population, and were at the time 3 out of 15 council seats. And so there's a lot of kind of anger about that, and also really real problems of underrepresentation. And that's kind of like one backdrop to understand in parts of the conversation. Another thing that I think gets a bit lost is, so they're talking a lot about increasing Latino political power, and they're sort of griping about places where they feel like Black political power overshadows Latino political power, but they're not actually scheming to, like gerrymander Black districts, which is one thing that I've seen, like as the kind of conversation has gone on. It's actually like a bit more complicated. They talk quite a bit about fighting to protect Curran Price, who is, you've seen in the news this week, was criminally charged.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah. But so fighting to protect his seat, and he is a Black council member. Granted, his seat is a district it's a historically Black seat, and it's a district that's now 4/5 Latino. So it's why, and at the time, Price was up for re-election in 2022, so he was about to potentially win a third term, and he's termed out in 2026. So it's kind of widely thought that that seat will be a Latino seat after 2026. So they're talking about it as a future Latino seat, but they're also fighting very hard to protect the assets within his district and also get Price reelected, because he was a political ally of theirs.
Oh, I'm going to come back to Curran Price because you broke another big story this week. But can we just talk about KDL for a minute? I want to. So for those who are, just catching up on it or to remember what happened. So there was former City Council President Nuri Martinez, Kevin De Leon, Gil Cedillo, and Ron Herrera were the 4 people who were involved in these tapes. And okay, so Cedillo had already lost his re-election bid. Martinez and Herrera resigned after the story came out. But Kevin De Leon very stubbornly committed to staying on the city council. I just saw him there the other day. So there were a lot of protests in the early days afterwards, lots of people, at City Hall. Can you talk a little bit about why it is, how is he able to hold on? And what does that say about maybe the teeth of this story in general, or about political fortunes? And does the news sort of move on quickly enough that somebody could actually survive a story like this, or is this evidencing something else more nuanced that we should be paying attention to?
Well, the very short answer, which isn't nuanced at all, is Section 207 of the city charter dictates how someone can be removed from their seat, and public shaming is not on there. There's very kind of specific reasons, including being convicted of a felony, which is how we just saw Mark Ridley Thomas be removed from his seat. But there's no provision for fellow council members to oust one of their own unless they're awaiting criminal trial. So it there's like all the political fortune of it, but just in terms of the actual, he has his seat until 2024. So he would really have to decide to step down short of that. But I think you're asking a much broader question. And to me, this has been one of the more interesting political stories in LA. No one thought he was going to not resign during a week when everyone from President Joe Biden on down called for his resignation. And he was very clear that he had no plans to step down. And he has hung on, and in a really, for a long time there were like massive protests in the council about him being there, and those have really quieted down. But he has a real well of support in his district, which is Boyle Heights and downtown, parts of Northeast LA. He has, he's been really doubled down on just constituent services in his district. He, if you look at his Instagram, it's fascinating. He's always, doing bingo at a senior citizen center, or ribbon cuttings at the opening of a park, or doing a food giveaway where they have his picture on the side of the food box they're giving away. And I think like him or not, he's managed to play a pretty smart political, he's managed to navigate through this in a way that very few people expected he would be able to. The question now is what happens next for him. He has not yet said whether he plans to run for re-election. So again, his seat is up in 2024. A couple of pretty well-known politicians who were formerly very close allies of his, including Miguel Santiago, have gotten into that race. And it's unclear if he's going to run again. But I would not rule out his chances if he runs again because of the support in his district.
It's so, I hate to make this comparison, but it feels almost Trump-like in the lack of shame, right? And we generally don't think shame is a good thing, but we think shamelessness is also not a good thing. And it seems like we realize you can't legislate around shame, but if a person, you sort of expect at some point that a leader, when confronted with when confronted publicly with some of their greatest moral failings, would recognize that their job is to step aside and let the work of the city or the work of the country continue. And yet I think Trump demonstrated again and again and again from the very start of his political career that maybe you just don't have to. Maybe you just keep going. And as he said, I remember when he said, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and my people will still support me. And, and of course he's right, but our system sort of depends on leaders saying, I think it's not the time for me to continue here because it's distracting from the work of the city. And clearly he has made the decision to persist. And
I would also argue that it's a bit more like it's his supporters, or it's not like a Trumpian kind of thing. It's, he has represented working class Latinos primarily. Like he has a lot of people who come in to support him, gives public comment in Spanish supporting him, and he argues, he's been a voice for his constituents in a way that few people have. And also that if he were to leave, he would leave his constituents without a voice on the city council. So if he were to have resigned, there likely would have been a special election, but his constituents would have been without a voting member for many, many months. Mm-hmm. And so he's that is his very strong argument that he makes.
And we do believe that, a person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. And so it's complicated. I mean, the whole story is complicated. I want to go back to current price. We'll have questions in a few minutes, but I want to just ask just a couple more pieces that I want to put out there for us. So I want to talk about current price. And okay, so just a few days ago, he was indicted by LA County LA County DA George Gascon for embezzlement, perjury, and conflict of interest charges. He stepped down from his committees. The council's considering suspending him now. You mentioned Mark Ridley Thomas. What's going on here in LA? I mean, really, how do we understand? We're in this bastion of a progressivism in this city, and I think the whole country sort of looks to Los Angeles among a couple of cities in the country for I remember saying at one of Mayor Garcetti's inaugurations, this is a hot spot for love and justice in the country. And really, what is going on here with this corruption and the racism and the perjury? And how do you understand who we are when we take an honest look at ourselves?
It's not great. I'd break it down into kind of a couple of smaller pieces. So with council members, former council members, Wiesar and Englander, who were both part of this very sprawling pay-to-play FBI probe, and both were criminally charged for that. I think that it's symptomatic of broader problems in terms of how land use decisions are made in Los Angeles, where we have this really Byzantine process that's pretty outdated, and so the system is so broken that individual council members end up having a huge amount of power. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people argue that that has created the space for this kind of corruption. And with that scandal, there were quite a few other players who were not members of the council who were also criminally charged as part of these development deals. Mark Ridley Thomas is sort of a separate situation because what happened with him happened while he was actually a county supervisor. So what actually City Hall?
Still an LA elected leader.
He was an LA elected official when it's very much played into this public perception of LA City Council is just a deeply, deeply flawed body. One thing that's been really interesting kind of coming out of all of these scandals there's been a real push for reform, like local government reform. And so that's kind of playing out in a couple of ways right now. The city council itself they have an ad hoc committee on city governance reform, which sounds really boring, but it's actually super interesting. And they've been on kind of a traveling tour around town of meetings out in the community where they're talking about a number of changes, including creating an independent redistricting committee. Mm-hmm. Because right now, so state and county both have independent redistricting committees. Right now, insanely, I shouldn't say insanely because it's something I cover, but it's not great. LA's I think it's objectively, there's problems with the current system, which is that members of the city council and other elected officials basically appoint proxies. So there's kind of a really thin veneer of independence, but then the proxies just fight for whatever their elected wants. And it's, not at all an independent system. So there's a big push to create an actual independent redistricting commission in LA. There's also a big push to increase the size of a city council. A lot of people argue that could help with both. So right now, each LA City Council member represents about 260,000 people, which is more than any other city council in the country. Mm-hmm. There's 15 city council members, and it's been that size since the mid-20s, but the city has grown very, very much since then. By comparison, New York, has 50-some council members. And then there's also a push to beef up the City Ethics Commission, which is another one of those things that sounds pretty arcane, but them having a bit more power to really kind of, they need better funding and more, kind of be a bit more potent, I think could potentially be really helpful.
Mm. I want to ask you one last question, and then we'll open it up for a couple questions from the community, which is really a personal question for you. I think in the course of the last 7 years, we have just seen really grotesque overt attempts to eviscerate the power of an independent press in this country. And I feel, 10 years ago, could we have imagined librarians on the front lines, journalists on the front lines, teachers on the front lines? I mean, there's been like a whole overturning and creation of a new order in our country. And journalists really have been targeted, really throughout the Trump administration. I think we're still, like, there's a healing that's, that needs to happen. And I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit about why you wanted to go into this work, what drives you, and especially when it's dangerous and hard to tell the truth, what motivates you to keep telling the truth day after day, Julie? I'm so curious for us to learn from a personal standpoint.
It's a much more grand way of thinking about it than I normally think about it. But, I feel I'm from LA, it's an incredible privilege to get to work at my hometown paper and also to get to write about City Hall, which is something I really care about. I really believe that, making the process kind of interesting and something the average person can follow can help spur engagement in local government, which is something I care about. But I've always been really interested in other people's lives, which I think when I was a kid, I first wanted to be a spy, and then I was like, oh no, that's not really for me. But it was just another way I could kind of get paid to go and ask people questions. But I think it's a really important time for holding power to account as well, and also it's a time with so much misinformation that just figuring out kind of how do you not just tell a true story, but make it so that a person can digest what's actually happening, particularly when you're writing about systems that are so complicated that, it's my job to go to City Hall, several days a week, and I sit in LA City Council meetings, I watch what is happening. I am often confused when I'm following a certain vote, whether they have just voted on the thing that I am following, and it's literally my job to go there and do this. But the process is really confusing. And so I'm often like, wow, if I'm just confused by whether they actually voted on this item or not, or they didn't vote on this item, what chance does someone who isn't paid to come here and watch this for knowing what's going on? And so I think that, sorry, and there's a bit of a kind of meandering answer, but no, I feel like it's important to make these processes legible.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm so glad that you do. We all benefit because of it. If it's okay, I would love if we could take just a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap. So, okay. I think actually, Rabbi Len, did you have a question first?
Hi. I was wondering if Kevin DeLeon, if I recall correctly, he was removed from the committees that he served. So how does that affect the community? Because you described what seemed to me to be all that he had left to do. And so how can you go forward as a constituent, even if your guy can't really advocate on the committees? Anyway. So it was more a fact. Has he been suspended, and where are we at?
Sorry, you said has he been, he's still off his committees, yes. And the committees are aware a lot of kind of the nuts and bolts of what legislation actually looks like happens. So that is it really does kind of curb his power in the city council. Price as well just announced he was stepping down from his committees. And, this is a very good question about, I think the council is really struggling right now to figure out what their way forward should be when they have council members in these kind of extraordinary situations. Because setting aside KDL for a second and going back to Price, they created this precedent with Jose Huizar and Mark Ridley Thomas, where when someone is criminally charged, we suspend them, which makes sense when it's an extraordinary thing that happens once a generation or every few decades. And now they're having their third suspension vote in as many years for Price coming up. And so they're really kind of, with this vote, and sorry, I've jumped from your question a little bit, but I think this is an interesting thing because it's coming up as well. So with Huizar, they voted on his suspension I believe before he had even, it was like the day the charges came down, they just right away voted, and it was a unanimous vote, if I remember correctly, or it was like 14-1. Well, no, it would have been, I think it might have been, he wouldn't have voted on it. So I think it was 14-0, but don't fact check me on that because it was several years ago. With MRT, they waited like a week, maybe not even a week, it was a couple of days after he was charged. And there was a bit more pushback about what it would mean for his district, but it still happened pretty fast. And with Price, they're really slowing down the process. Council President Paul Krikorian introduced the suspension motion, but he kind of framed it very much as a process. He said, we want to hear from Price's constituents about what they want, because there isn't really a good option. Either you put in a non-voting caretaker for the district and they don't have a vote, or you put in a temporary council member and then 260,000 people are being represented by someone they didn't vote for. And I also think that that district will be particularly complicated. It'll be a real minefield for Krikorian in terms of if Price is suspended and if they're trying to put in a temporary replacement in terms of who he picks, because it's a district that, again, is historically black district that's currently represented by a black council member. It's also a district that's 4/5 Latino now. And so I think that it will be a really delicate kind of choice to be made if he gets to that place.
Thank you. Sean and Sarah.
So the thing that I think makes you a local hero is LAist, to be honest. I mean, the Pulitzer's amazing, but LAist brought local news, like local news is under attack, right? Nationally. The money for coverage, the shuttering of local papers. And yet, it's the place where your coverage shows us where democracy is on the line. The attacks that we see from extremists, right, so frequently are happening in local government. Local boards, local commissions, city council votes, school board votes. Can you talk a little bit about how the environment, how you see the environment has changed, where it's going, and what can we do to strengthen coverage of local government? Because it's the most intimate relationship that any of us have with a government, right?
Subscribe to your local paper. That I mean, if you like whatever you're reading. We are having cuts right now at the LA Times. About 13% of our staff was just laid off. Wow. One of the things that means is our print deadlines are going to have already become much earlier, so our stories are going to be less in-depth when they go to print in the morning, just by virtue of time, because people have been laid off whose jobs make it so that the deadlines have to be brought earlier. But not just the LA Times, you know, whatever you support, public radio, LAist, KPCC just had a bunch of layoffs. Whatever you read and wherever you get your information, I'd really urge you to support those outlets. And, you know, I'm relatively new to covering the City Hall beat. I'm really lucky to work with a couple of colleagues who are fantastic and have been there for many, many years. And as they describe it to me, you know, there's only a handful of reporters now who are there on a regular day, not like a day where something crazy is happening. And that didn't used to be the case. There's all these kind of like empty offices in the press suite where there used to just be much more eyes on everything.
Okay, we're going to take one last question from Sarah, and then I'm going to close us, but if people want to stick around for a couple minutes after for questions, perhaps we can do that.
I noticed that after the story broke, that in the weekend section, there were like feature articles on Oaxacan restaurants and local Zapotecas and other indigenous Mexicans in that same section. Was that a coincidence or restorative justice?
Definitely was not a good, thank you for reading, definitely was not a coincidence. One of the many awful things said in the tapes, there were some really offensive comments made about Oaxacans, and we have one of our reporters at the paper who is actually, her mother is Oaxacan, wrote a fantastic story about the impact on the Oaxacan community, but I think people felt really strongly about wanting to show up, kind of show just how rich. LA is one of the largest Oaxacan communities, I think, outside of Mexico, if not the largest, okay. I always say one of when I don't have it in front of me. And so no, that was very much a concerted effort.
Steve Burns, did you have a question before we close? I'm going to give you the last word because of your incredible years of dedication and leadership to IKAR's justice work. You have earned it, so go for it.
Thank you. Did LA Fed pursue the LA Times at all legally after threatening to do so?
Good question.
No, not to my knowledge. But I don't want to encourage it. I mean, I think that's normally like, you make the threat. I don't think you typically do. Maybe you do.
That's good. That's
Yeah.
really important for this story because actually the threat of legal action, I think, often leads people to it does suppress it does suppress speech. So it's really thank you for sharing that last detail. I just want to say that it is really important to this community that we are not only dreaming big dreams about how to save the planet and how to save democracy, but also really working in very strategic ways at the local level and at the statewide level. And Brooke is in the room. Lots of our Minyan-Tzedek leadership is in this room. So can I just see waves of hands? Current Minyan-Tzedek leadership. Thank you. So I see Marty and Brianna and Elisa and Steve and Brooke. These are the folks to come, and Lisa, to come talk to, what? Oh, and Rabbi Jensen. Yes. So these are the folks to come talk to either after our discussion today or any of the days moving forward because they really have a very deep understanding of what the work is that needs to be done in the days ahead. And so I'm deeply grateful to all of you for continuing to guide us, even as our hearts are stretched to the greatest outer circle, to keep pulling us back home. Because as we always say here, if you dream of building the beloved community out there, you have to start by building the beloved community in here. And that means both in our IKAR community, but also in our Los Angeles community. And Julia, I'm amazed at how much you have achieved in only you're just beginning your career now, and I really bless you with good health and with strength and with the courage to continue to do this incredible work. And one can only imagine what will come next from your incredibly imaginative mind and heart. And we feel so honored to have you in our midst, and we're so very proud of you. So thank you. Thank you
so much. I feel so honored to be a part of this community.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna start Birkat Hamazon for those who want to join me. Otherwise, you can feel free to try and grab Julia as she makes her way out the door. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom.